When Imani Carter's teenage brother is suspended for defending himself, her world shifts from quiet frustration to fiery purpose. A rising voice in her community, Imani knows the system is broken. But when it strikes her family, the injustice becomes personal. As she battles school boards, public opinion, and her own fear, she discovers that fighting back comes at a cost. This is a gripping modern-day story of racial injustice, resilience, and revolution, where one Black woman must decide how far she'll go to protect her brother and ignite a movement they can no longer ignore. Imani Carter was used to moving through the world cautiously. At 28, she had perfected the art of being unthreatening. Soft voice, open hands, smile even when it hurt. There was safety in being palatable. It was a quiet armor, one she wore since girlhood, refined over years of watching her mother navigate the world with grace and strategic silence. She grew up in East Baltimore, where sirens were lullabies and silence was suspicious. Her neighborhood, Franklin Square, bore the scars of redlining and neglect. Vacant row homes with boarded windows stood like forgotten tombstones. But in between the cracks, there was life. Music spilling from stoops, kids double-dutching on the corners, and corner stores where you could get a bag of chips, a lesson, and a hug from Miss Dot behind the counter. Imani had been different since she was little. She was the kid who stayed after school to help clean up, who carried a book in her backpack when everyone else carried burdens. Her mother, Celeste, worked 2 jobs, nursing home aide by day, janitor by night, and poured every ounce of herself into making sure Imani and her younger sister Amara stayed fed, safe, and seen. "You're gonna do more than survive," Celeste told her often, smoothing her daughter's curls with calloused hands. "You're gonna rise." And she did. Thanks to a full scholarship and countless late nights fueled by vending machine coffee and gospel playlists, Imani graduated summa cum laude from Howard University with a degree in data science. She was fascinated by patterns, how numbers could predict behaviors, tell stories, uncover truths hidden beneath the noise. It made her feel powerful, capable, like she could see the world's secrets and reshape them into something more just. After graduation, she secured a job at Everdata, a rising tech firm in DC. They liked her efficiency, her attention to detail, her ability to explain complex trends in plain language. She was one of only 4 Black women in the building, and the only one in her department, but she made herself useful, indispensable even. She joined every committee, organized team-building outings, mentored interns. She didn't just want to belong. She wanted to prove she deserved to. She lived in a modest 1-bedroom apartment in Anacostia. It wasn't flashy, but it had a view of the river and enough space for a desk by the window. On weekends, she visited her mom and Amara, brought groceries, helped with homework, and listened to stories about the neighborhood. What had changed, what hadn't. Every morning, Imani boarded the Green Line with her earbuds in, a podcast queued, usually something by Brené Brown or Nicole Hannah-Jones, and her ID badge tucked neatly into her backpack. She wore simple clothes, neat and pressed, no flashy jewelry. Her curly hair was tied back in a puff, and her posture was always straight, prepared. Life was predictable, controlled, structured. That was how she kept herself safe. She knew what it meant to be seen and not seen at the same time. Knew that excellence didn't always protect you, but it was the best shield she had. She didn't date much. There wasn't time, she told herself. But truthfully, there was something exhausting about being vulnerable in a world that already expected her to carry so much. She had friends, mostly from college, a few from work, but her trust was rationed, earned slowly. Most nights, she cooked simple meals: quinoa, roasted vegetables, baked salmon if she was feeling fancy. She listened to jazz when she needed to decompress. Nina Simone, Esperanza Spalding. Sometimes Lauryn Hill when the day had been heavy. On Wednesday nights, She tutored coding at the local library, helping high school students from the neighborhood build apps and websites. She saw herself in them, the same spark, the same questions, the same hunger to be more than what the world expected. Imani believed in impact, in doing the work quietly, consistently. She didn't march or post long threads on Twitter, though she supported those who did. Her activism was in the spreadsheets, the boardrooms, the code she wrote to highlight disparities in city data, the policy briefs she emailed to council members, even when she didn't get a reply. She believed that change came in layers, and she was building one brick at a time. But beneath the routine, there was always a quiet hum of tension, a knowing that no matter how polished, how educated, how careful she was, she could still be mistaken, reduced, stripped of her complexity, that the world didn't always care about the nuances of who she was, that to someone in uniform, she might just be another body on the sidewalk. Still, she pressed forward, one morning at a time. On October 12th, she woke to gray skies and drizzle tapping the window. She made her usual tea, hibiscus with honey, tied her scarf, and checked the forecast. She packed an umbrella and her laptop, grabbed her Metro card, and headed to the station. The city moved around her in rhythms, cars honking, buses sighing to a halt, the shuffle of morning commuters. She smiled at the barista she always passed, nodded at the elderly man who sold newspapers by the corner. Familiar, safe. She didn't know this was the day everything would change. The morning light spilled across Imani Carter's modest kitchen table, bouncing off her laptop screen where a job application blinked back at her, a final prompt asking her to confirm submission. She hesitated, fingers hovering over the mouse. It was her 7th application this week. She had graduated magna cum laude with a degree in environmental science from Howard University and had interned with one of the most prestigious sustainability firms in D.C. Still, the silence after interviews had become its own kind of rejection. Empty inboxes, hollow, "We've decided to move forward with other candidates," or worse, no response at all. She clicked submit and exhaled. From the next room, her younger brother Khalil's voice filtered in. "Imani, can you braid my hair before school?" "Coming," she called back, already standing. Khalil, 14, lanky and brilliant, had his heart set on becoming an aerospace engineer. His walls were covered with posters of Mae Jemison and Dr. George Carruthers. But beneath his brilliance, Imani saw the weight he was starting to carry. The way he glanced over his shoulder when walking home. The way his body tensed when a police car cruised by. She braided his hair and practiced silence, weaving not just strands, but prayers into each section. For protection, for strength, for the armor he would need simply to walk through the world in his skin. "You know," he said quietly, "Ms. Rayner said I should think about trade school instead of college." Imani's hands paused mid-braid. "What? Why would she say that?" "She said I get distracted too much in class." Khalil's grades were all A's and B's. He'd been invited to join a youth coding program last summer. Imani knew exactly what was happening. "She doesn't see your brilliance," she said firmly. "That doesn't mean it's not there. Keep your head up, okay?" He nodded, and she kissed the top of his head, willing away the rage quietly boiling in her chest. That afternoon, Imani met with her caseworker at the Urban Green Initiative. She'd been freelancing with them since graduation, project-based contracts, no benefits. It was work she was passionate about. Building community gardens in food deserts, organizing climate justice workshops for youth in low-income neighborhoods. But it wasn't sustainable. She wanted a full-time role, somewhere she could plant roots and grow, somewhere she belonged. "Imani, your work's incredible," her supervisor Lori said with a soft smile. "But the board passed over your name again for the community outreach coordinator position." Imani's stomach dropped. May I ask why? There were concerns about your leadership experience, and one of the board members mentioned they were looking for someone with a more professional presence. Imani blinked. I've led 7 outreach projects in the last year. Lori shifted uncomfortably. I'm just the messenger. Imani nodded, the words sinking like cold stones. She knew what professional presence meant. She'd heard it before, just in different packaging. Her natural curls deemed unpolished. Her tone, when advocating for community members, called too assertive. Her very existence somehow, too much. She left the building with clenched fists, the city buzzing around her. Sirens shouting, the thrum of subway trains underground. Was she supposed to straighten her hair? Lower her voice? Dim her light just to be seen as worthy? That evening, back at her apartment, she poured herself a cup of tea and sank onto the couch. Her phone lit up with a news alert. Black teens stopped and frisked outside school. No charges, but video shows excessive force. The thumbnail image showed a young boy, face pressed into the pavement, blood on his cheek, a white officer's knee in his back. It could have been Khalil. She couldn't bring herself to watch the video. She didn't need to. She had already seen it 1,000 times. Different names, different cities, same script. She thought of her parents, her father who had passed when she was in high school, and her mother who worked 2 jobs and still called every Sunday night with encouragement. They had both raised her with a quiet but unshakable faith in justice, in dignity. But lately, that faith felt cracked. She opened a notebook and began to write, the words pouring out in a stream of fury and grief and resolve. How do you tell a child that their skin is a target? How do you dream when the world calls you danger before it learns your name? She closed the notebook and pressed it to her chest. It was the only place she could put the weight sometimes. Later, Khalil sat beside her on the couch, his eyes on the same news alert. Do you think they'll ever stop seeing us like that? He asked softly. She looked at him. His youth, his vulnerability, his wide-eyed hunger for the world. No, she said honestly, not all of them. But that doesn't mean we stop fighting to be seen. He leaned against her, and they sat in silence. Outside, the city pulsed. Beneath the same sky, injustice thrived in the shadows, but so did hope. Imani didn't know how or when things would change, but she knew that the fire inside her couldn't go out. Not now, not ever. It started with a phone call. Imani had just finished compiling a grant proposal for a grassroots food sovereignty project when her cell rang. The number flashing across the screen was the high school. A chill crept up her spine before she even picked up. Ms. Carter? The voice on the other end said. This is Principal Holloway. There was an incident involving Khalil this morning. Imani felt her heart seize. What kind of incident? He was involved in an altercation. The school resource officer had to intervene. He's being suspended for 5 days, pending review. Imani's hand gripped the phone tighter. What happened? Is he hurt? No injuries. He raised his voice during an argument with another student and refused to comply with directions to leave the area. The other student claimed he felt threatened. Imani's voice dropped. Was the other student white? A pause. Yes, but race had nothing to do with... Don't say that. Imani cut in, the calm in her voice sharper than any scream. I'll be there in 20 minutes. By the time she arrived, Khalil sat alone outside the front office, his backpack slouched at his feet, shoulders hunched like a boy trying to disappear into himself. Baby, are you okay? She asked. He nodded but didn't look at her. Principal Holloway greeted her with the robotic politeness of someone who had already made up his mind. Thank you for coming in. We take all incidents seriously. Khalil disrupted the learning environment and disregarded instructions from a school authority. Who was the other student? Imani asked. A peer named Jared Thompson. Did Jared receive any disciplinary action? He reported feeling unsafe, and our investigation showed that Khalil escalated the situation. He raised his voice? That's escalation now. The officer on site was concerned for the safety of other students. Imani stood abruptly, her voice steady but lit from within. This isn't discipline. It's profiling. My brother is a child, a brilliant, gentle child who raised his voice and was treated like a threat. He's 14. Jared doesn't feel unsafe. He's weaponizing your bias. Holloway stiffened. I understand your frustration. No, you don't, she snapped. You've never had to wonder if your little brother's going to survive being a teenager. She signed the suspension paperwork with a bitter taste in her mouth, the weight of it pressing against her like a stone. Later that night, she and Khalil sat on the balcony of their apartment, under a sky smeared with city haze. Below them, sirens wailed in the distance. Above, stars tried to push through. I didn't even touch him, Khalil said. He said something about how kids like me don't belong in honors classes, and I told him to shut up. That's it. Imani's hands clenched into fists. This world's gonna come at you with everything it's got, Khalil, and it's going to expect you to bow, to be grateful for crumbs. But you don't shrink for anyone. You hear me? He nodded, but his eyes were glassy, his voice small. What if they already made up their minds about me? She wrapped an arm around him, holding him close. Then we make our own story. They don't get to write our ending. The next day, Imani took a detour on her way to a community meeting and stopped at the library, researching school suspension rates. The numbers screamed at her from the page. Black students were 3 times more likely to be suspended than white peers for the same infractions. In some cities, the disparity was even greater. Zero tolerance policies? The school-to-prison pipeline. It was systemic. It was scripted. And Khalil was being dragged into its current. At the meeting, she couldn't sit still. Her usual focus was fractured, her thoughts churning like a storm just beneath her skin. I'm sorry, she said as she stood to address the room. I know we're here to talk about community composting, but I need to say something. A few heads turned. Some nodded in quiet recognition. My little brother got suspended yesterday for raising his voice. That's all. A white kid provoked him, and suddenly he was labeled dangerous. I'm tired of watching us get punished just for existing. It's happening in our schools, our jobs, our streets. We're expected to be silent while systems grind us down. I'm not going to be silent anymore. Applause rippled through the room, small but sincere. One woman, older, with silver locks and a kind face, stood and spoke. Speak truth, baby, because if we don't, they'll bury it. That night, something in Imani shifted. The weight of the past few days hadn't lifted, but it had found a direction, a shape, resistance. She pulled out her notebook and began to write again. Not poetry this time, but plans. Ideas. A workshop on racial bias in schools. A coalition of parents and educators. Letters to the school board. Social media campaigns. She wasn't going to wait for permission anymore. But the world wasn't done testing her. 2 days later, she received a call from Urban Green. Her freelance contract wouldn't be renewed. Budget cuts, Lori said softly. I'm so sorry. Imani didn't believe her. She could hear the discomfort in Lori's voice, the guilt. Someone had gotten uncomfortable with Imani being too vocal, too visible, too black. She hung up without saying much, her mind spinning. Rent was due in 3 weeks. She had bills. Khalil needed new shoes. Her savings were already thin. Imani stood at the window and looked out at the city she had given so much to, the community she still loved, even when it failed her. She wasn't just tired. She was furious. Furious at the job interviews where she'd been passed over for less qualified white candidates. Furious at school administrators who saw her brother as a problem instead of a prodigy. Furious at the quiet way doors kept closing in her face, always with a smile, always with polite words that couldn't hide the ugly truth. She didn't know what would come next, but she knew this. She was not going to break. Not here. Not like this. The days after her contract ended were slow, heavy. Imani woke to the sound of the world moving on without her. Garbage trucks groaning outside, delivery vans passing beneath her window, the soft buzz of her neighbors' routines. She had applied to 5 jobs that morning. She had $3.89 left in her checking account. There was no safety net, no fallback. Her mother had offered to send something, but Imani refused. She wasn't going to drain her mother's meager savings, not when she was working 2 jobs just to stay afloat. She'd find another way. The stress, the ache, the knot in her chest, it didn't crush her. Not yet. It just hardened her, tempered her. She poured herself into her notebook again, into pages filled with purpose. She wrote out her story, the job discrimination, the silent boardrooms, the coded language of not a good fit. She wrote about Khalil's suspension and the school's refusal to hear him. And she posted it online. It wasn't a cry for help. It was a declaration. My name is Imani Carter. I am Black. I am brilliant. And I am done asking for permission to be whole. My little brother was suspended for standing up for himself. I lost my job for being too vocal. If they're going to come for us anyway, let them come knowing we won't be quiet. She added a hashtag, number IMANISPEAKS. She logged off and went to make lunch, rice and beans, stretching the last of what she had. But by the time she returned to her phone, the post had gone viral. Hundreds of shares, thousands, people from across the country commenting, teachers, parents, students, Black women tagging each other. This is us. One reply stood out from the swirl of support. I work with a local news outlet. Would you be willing to share your story on record? Imani stared at the message for a long time. Her gut twisted. She thought of Khalil, of what attention like this might mean. There was always a cost to telling the truth out loud, but there was a greater cost to staying silent. She typed back simply, yes. The interview was scheduled 2 days later. A young Black reporter named Maya met her at a local cafe, recorder in hand, her presence warm and clear-eyed. Off the record, Maya said gently, you don't owe anyone your pain, but if you're ready, this story could open eyes. I'm not trying to go viral, Imani said. I want people to stop pretending this isn't happening. Let's tell it right. And they did. Imani spoke for hours about being passed over for promotions while white colleagues were praised for less, about school resource officers treating Black kids like inmates instead of students, about how exhausting it was to be seen as angry just for having boundaries. Maya listened, really listened, not just with questions, but with empathy. And when the article went live a week later, it didn't just highlight Imani's story, it wove it into a larger truth. Professional is not a synonym for white. Disruptive is not a synonym for Black. These aren't isolated incidents. They're patterns. They're the system. The headline read, "We don't need to tone it down. We need to burn it down. One woman's stand against everyday injustice." It was electric, and it caught fire. Over the next few days, Imani received dozens of messages. Some were from strangers, people thanking her, sharing their own stories of silent discrimination. Others were from local organizers inviting her to speak, to collaborate. One message, though, caught her completely off guard. "We saw your story. We're starting a youth advocacy initiative on racial equity in schools. Would you consider leading it?" It was from a new nonprofit, Voices Forward, focused on disrupting the school-to-prison pipeline. The director, a black woman named Teresa Daniels, wanted to meet. Imani stared at the message. Her throat tightened. Something was shifting. She met Teresa in a sunlit co-working space filled with art and plants, a stark contrast to the sterile boardrooms she'd been used to. Teresa was in her 40s, with locks streaked gray and a no-nonsense calm that made Imani feel safe. "We don't need another face for the website," Teresa said. "We need someone who's lived this, who can lead from that place. The job's yours if you want it." Imani was stunned. "You haven't even seen my resume." Teresa smiled. "I've seen your fire. That's what we need." Tears burned behind Imani's eyes, but she held them back. Not out of pride, just reverence. Something sacred was blooming, something earned. That night she told Khalil the news. He didn't say much, just gave her a long, tight hug and whispered, "You deserve this." Imani held on to him for a beat longer than she meant to. But not everyone celebrated. 2 days later, an anonymous email landed in her inbox. "Watch your back. You're making enemies." No name, no return address. She tried to shrug it off, but it lingered. So did the second message. "Stay in your lane, little girl." She didn't show them to Khalil. He'd already learned too much too young. Instead, she walked out onto the balcony, looked up at the sky, and whispered a truth she needed to hear out loud. "I'm not afraid of the dark anymore. I've been living in it too long to be scared now." The sky above didn't answer, but in the quiet, Imani swore it was listening. Imani stood on the stage at a local town hall meeting, a modest community center packed shoulder to shoulder. Her palms were damp, but her voice held steady. The microphone buzzed slightly under her grip. Behind her was a banner that read, "Youth Voices, Safer Schools, a Town Hall for Justice." To her left sat 2 local school board members. On her right, parents, educators, and community leaders. And front and center, Khalil, arms crossed, eyes locked on hers with pride. "I didn't come here to make people comfortable," Imani began. "I came here to tell the truth." She told them about the suspensions, about how black children were being criminalized before they were even old enough to drive, about how one administrator's discomfort could derail a child's future. "Do you know what that does to a kid?" she asked. "To always be seen through a lens of suspicion?" "My brother is brilliant. He builds robots in our living room. He dreams of launching satellites. But all it takes is one scared teacher, one whisper of threat, and it could all be gone. Just like that." She paused. The silence was thick. "This isn't about bad kids. It's about bad systems. It's about the lie that says we're too loud, too angry, too much, and the danger in shrinking ourselves just to be allowed in the room." Applause broke like thunder, but she saw the faces that didn't clap, the tight-lipped principals, the uncomfortable donors, the local reporter who had been taking notes with thinly veiled skepticism. Still, she held her ground. She had stopped playing nice. Later that night, while scrolling through her notifications, she found a comment that caught her breath. "Maybe if you focused more on being a sister than an activist, your brother wouldn't be in trouble." Another, "Nobody ever suspended him for being black. Maybe teach him some respect." She stared at the screen. Her pulse thundered in her ears. The comments kept coming, some subtle, others venomous. "You're what's wrong with this country. Keep running your mouth, and you'll end up just like the rest." She closed her laptop. Khalil walked in with a bowl of cereal. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," she lied. But something was wrong. Not just the messages. The air itself felt different. Thicker. Charged. The next morning, her car wouldn't start. It hadn't been touched the night before. She was sure of it. But the windshield had been cracked, and the word liar was scrawled in black marker across the hood. She stared at it for a long time before calling the police. The officer who showed up was white, mid-40s, and deeply uninterested. "Could be kids, could be random," he shrugged. "It wasn't random," Imani replied. "I've been receiving threats since I started speaking out." He didn't write anything down. "Well, unless you got cameras, there's not much we can do." Imani clenched her jaw. "That's it?" He tipped his hat. "Good luck." She watched him drive away without so much as a second glance, her heart pounding with something deeper than fear. Rage. How quickly they dismissed her. How easily the system protected itself even in its indifference. That night, Teresa called her from voices forward. "I heard about the car," she said. "Do you want to take some time off? We can pause the rollout of the school advocacy program." Imani hesitated. Every part of her was tired, bone-deep tired. But the thought of pulling back felt worse, like surrender. "No," she said. "We don't pause this. If I stop now, they win." There was silence on the other end. "You remind me of myself 20 years ago," Teresa finally said. "Just be careful. Even strong women break when they're carrying too much alone." The next day, Khalil wasn't at school. When Imani called the front office, they told her he'd been marked absent from his first 2 classes. Her heart dropped. She tried his phone. No answer. She called again. Straight to voicemail. She threw on a hoodie, grabbed her keys, and ran. She found him an hour later, sitting alone at the park near their apartment, hunched over on a bench, his hoodie pulled up. "Khalil!" she shouted, breathless. He looked up slowly. His eyes were red. She rushed to him, arms around him before he could speak. "Why didn't you answer your phone?" "I left it in my locker," he mumbled. I needed to breathe." Imani pulled back and looked at him. "Talk to me." He swallowed hard. "Some kids followed me after second period, called me a thug, said I was only in honors 'cause of pity. One of them shoved me." Imani's stomach turned to stone. "I walked out before I did something stupid," he said. "I didn't want to make it worse." She sat beside him, both of them quiet. "You did the right thing," she whispered. "But I'm sorry you even had to make that choice." His voice cracked. "What's the point, Imani? Even when I do everything right, it's never enough." She felt tears sting her eyes but refused to let them fall. "Because it's not about what you do," she said. "It's about what they see. And we're gonna change that. Brick by brick." "But I'm tired." "So am I. But we don't stop. We rest, we breathe, and then we get back up." He nodded slowly, head on her shoulder. They stayed there until the sky turned lavender and the streetlights flickered on. That night, Imani opened her notebook, her hands trembling but firm. She wrote not just for herself, but for every girl who had been told she was too loud, every boy who had been told to shrink, every voice forced into silence. She wrote through the fear, through the exhaustion, through the noise. Because the fire inside her wasn't rage alone, it was love. Fierce, uncompromising, revolutionary. The auditorium buzzed like a hive, restless, electric, waiting. It was the district's annual school equity forum, a performative event where board members gave speeches about diversity and progress, while real problems smoldered quietly in the shadows. But this year, something had changed. This year, Imani Carter was on the panel. It wasn't an invitation. It was a demand, made by over 2,000 petition signatures, a rally staged outside the district office, and a coalition of educators who refused to let her voice be silenced. She sat near the edge of the stage in a dark green blazer, her locks pinned back, not out of decorum, but to show the face of a woman unafraid to be seen. Khalil sat in the front row beside Teresa and Maya. His eyes were fixed on her, a question swimming behind them. "You ready for this?" She nodded once. She was. When her turn came, the moderator gave her the floor with a tight smile and the kind of cautious neutrality reserved for people who made the powerful squirm. Imani stepped up to the mic. Her voice didn't waver. It carried like thunder wrapped in velvet. "I'm not here to congratulate you," she said. "And I'm not here for photo ops or platitudes. I'm here because the system you run is failing our children." Murmurs rose. In this very district, Black students make up 18% of the population and 52% of suspensions. You know this. You've seen the reports, but somehow it keeps happening. Why? A man in a gray suit shifted uncomfortably on stage beside her. Because your policies aren't just flawed. They're designed to protect your comfort, not our safety. You build prisons out of policies. You call it order. You say it's neutral. But let's be honest. Neutrality has always been the side of the oppressor. The room was quiet now, not hostile, just stunned. "I'm not here for reform. I'm here for reckoning." She took a breath, her gaze sweeping the crowd. "I'm here for my brother, who was suspended for defending himself. I'm here for the kids who are labeled disruptive, just for existing in bodies you fear. I'm here for the girls who are called loud, while white boys get to be leaders. And I'm here to say, we're not asking anymore. We're taking the mic back." Applause exploded through the room. The moderator looked flustered. Someone in the back tried to shout something, but it was drowned out by cheers and a standing ovation. She didn't smile. Not yet. There was still fire in her lungs. Later, outside the auditorium, Imani stood beneath the rustling shadows of old oak trees, her hands buzzing from adrenaline. A woman approached, white, mid-40s, with cautious eyes and a superintendent badge clipped to her coat. "You were passionate in there," she said. Imani raised an eyebrow. "That's one word for it. I hope you understand that change takes time." "No, it doesn't," Imani replied, calm but razor sharp. "It takes will. Time is just what people in power ask for when they don't want to lose it." The woman flushed. "We'll be reviewing the district's discipline protocols this summer. If you'd like to be involved." "I'll do more than be involved," Imani said. "I'm building something they can't ignore." The woman nodded once, curtly, and walked away. Over the next 2 weeks, the movement Imani had sparked grew louder. Imani Speaks became a rallying cry on social media. High schoolers across the city staged walkouts. Parents demanded racial equity audits. Teachers who had stayed quiet finally began to speak up. Khalil's suspension was quietly expunged, but Imani didn't let that be the end. She knew their fight wasn't about one boy's record. It was about the system that tried to mark him permanently. She founded the Horizon Project, a youth-led coalition that trained students to document racial bias in schools, to advocate for themselves, and to demand structural change. The first meeting had 7 people. By the end of the month, it had over 300. But success, too, had a cost. One night, around 2 a.m., she was jolted awake by the sound of pounding on her apartment door. She froze. More banging. Louder. Relentless. Khalil emerged from his room, his face pale. "Should we call someone?" But then came the shouting. We don't need your kind ruining our kids. You think you're a hero? You're just another troublemaker. It was three men, drunk, angry, faces half hidden by hoodies. Imani didn't open the door. She just grabbed her phone and dialed 911. But when the officers arrived, the men were already gone. The report was taken. Nothing more. No arrests. No follow-up. Just another reminder that her body, her voice, her fight came with no guarantees of protection. That night, she sat awake on the balcony, wrapped in a blanket, Khalil asleep on the couch inside. She looked up at the sky. So much of her life had been shaped by fear, of not being good enough, of standing out, of taking up space she was told didn't belong to her. But not anymore. They could come in the night. They could crack her windshield and send hateful emails. But they would never dim her flame again, because every threat was proof she was being heard, and that meant she was getting close. The next morning, she got a call from Maya. The Washington Post wants to feature your work. Imani blinked. You're kidding. They're sending a photographer next week. They want to talk about what you've built. Imani leaned against the wall, phone pressed to her cheek, silent for a beat. You okay? Maya asked. Yeah, I'm just trying to believe this is real. It is, and it's only the beginning. Later that day, Imani walked with Khalil to his school. A few kids nodded at her as they passed. Some whispered her name. Outside the gate, he stopped and looked up at her. You're not scared anymore, are you? He asked. Imani smiled, kneeling slightly to meet his eyes. I am, she admitted, but I rise anyway. He nodded slowly. Me too. She hugged him tight. And that makes you dangerous, in all the best ways. As she watched him disappear through the school doors, she knew she hadn't just survived. She had sparked something, and the fire was spreading. Spring broke open across the city like a soft exhale. Streets once grayed with winter now bloomed with color. Magnolia trees, heavy with petals, sidewalk chalk in bright, defiant scrawls, laughter echoing across park fields. Imani stood on the rooftop of the Voices Forward headquarters, looking out over a skyline that had watched her rise. She wore a simple t-shirt that read, Revolution is a seed. Below her, inside the building, over 100 students buzzed with energy. It was the official launch of the Horizon Project's summer leadership cohort. Workshops, community canvassing, storytelling labs, all led by youth, all designed to disrupt the cycles they had inherited. She could hear their voices through the open windows, young, loud, unfiltered. It made her smile. A year ago, none of this existed. A year ago, she'd been in a conference room shrinking in a suit she couldn't breathe in, holding her tongue to keep a paycheck. Now she was the executive director of a movement, not because she wanted power, but because she refused to be powerless. Behind her, Teresa stepped out onto the roof with 2 mugs of coffee. They're wild in there, she said, handing Imani one. Beautiful, messy, brilliant. Exactly how it should be, Imani replied, sipping. It's their space now. I just made room. Teresa studied her. You ever stop to take it in? Every day, even the hard ones. They stood in silence for a moment, bathed in the honeyed light of late afternoon. The world still had sharp edges, but for once, Imani wasn't flinching. I've been thinking, Teresa said gently, about legacy. Imani turned. I don't want to run this forever. I want to plant something that outlives me. Imani laughed softly. You sound like my mother. Smart woman, your mama. They clinked their mugs, and the wind carried the laughter down into the city. That weekend, Imani took Khalil on a surprise trip. They drove 2 hours outside the city to a stretch of farmland owned by a black co-op, a quiet haven of green where the stars would show up without needing permission. Khalil looked out the window as rows of trees flickered past. "So, what's the surprise?" Imani grinned. "You'll see." When they arrived, she led him past the old barn, out to a clearing with a small observatory dome at the edge. "No way," Khalil whispered. "You rented a telescope?" "Not just any telescope. This one tracks satellite clusters and solar flares." He looked at her like she had hung the moon herself. "You serious?" She handed him a key. "The woman who runs this place is an engineer. She wants to meet you. Said she could use an apprentice this summer." Khalil's mouth fell open. I don't even know what to say." "Just say you'll aim high," she said. "Always." That night, they lay on a blanket under a sky so wide it made her feel small in the best way. Khalil pointed out constellations, his voice animated, full of awe. Imani watched him, her heart full. "I used to think we were stuck under a ceiling," he said. "What changed?" He looked at her. "You kicked a hole in it." She smiled, brushing his locks back from his forehead. "Nah, you were always meant for the stars. I just cleared the clouds." Back in the city, momentum built around Imani's work. She was invited to speak at conferences, featured in national education journals, consulted by lawmakers. But she turned down the flashiest offers. The book deals, the TED Talk pitches. Because this movement wasn't about her. It was about every girl who'd been silenced, every boy who had to explain why he walked home with his hands visible. It was about community, continuity, change that grew like a vine, not a monument. And it was working. District policies were shifting. Bias training was no longer optional. Suspension rates were being reviewed with student oversight. Black kids were organizing, speaking, being heard. It wasn't perfect, but it was possible. One afternoon, Maya stopped by the office. "I just filed a story," she said. "Thought you should read the last paragraph." She handed over her phone. Imani read the closing lines of the article aloud. Imani Carter didn't wait for the system to catch up. She met the future at the intersection of rage and grace and built a home there for others to stand. She's not just a voice, she's a mirror. And in her reflection, we see the kind of world we've been too afraid to imagine. Imani swallowed the lump in her throat. "You really think I've made a difference?" Maya smiled. "I know it." Weeks later, on the anniversary of her first post, the one that had gone viral and changed everything, Imani sat alone on her balcony. She opened the same notebook where it all began. The pages were softer now, worn from touch. She flipped to the back, where a new entry waited. April 9th, 1 year later. "We're still here, still fighting, still rising, still loving even when it hurts." Khalil's learning to write code in Python. I'm learning to rest without guilt. And the sky above us? Still wide, still ours. She closed the book, looked up, and smiled.